Whose name is on the lease for this address?
It's my house. Why are you harassing me?
Sir, stand up. You don't live here. Move along. The officer's voice wasn't just loud, it was certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from facts, but from assumption. Marcus Thorne didn't jump. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look up right away. He sat on the top step of a 4-story brownstone, one hand resting on a folded Wall Street Journal, the other wrapped around a porcelain cup of Earl Grey. Steam rose into the cold autumn air, drifting past the iron gate and the carved stone railing he'd paid to restore decades ago. "I do live here," Marcus said, calm as a judge reading a verdict. "And you're standing on my steps." The officer took one more step closer. "Id. Now, or you're going in cuffs." Marcus finally lifted his eyes. Dark. Steady. Completely unimpressed. "I'm not resisting," he said. "But you're about to arrest the owner of this entire building because a stranger pointed at him." Across the sidewalk, the stranger, a young white tenant in spotless running gear, stood with his arms crossed like he'd just won something. He kept glancing at the officer, then back at Marcus, waiting for the moment authority did what he called it here to do. The officer didn't turn to verify anything, didn't ask a single neighbor, didn't check a single record. He just reached for the handcuffs. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Marcus nodded once, not in submission, but in warning. "Do it," he said quietly. And every second of what happens next becomes evidence. Phones were already up. A woman across the street had stopped watering her plants. A delivery driver slowed down, watching. The whole block felt like it held its breath, because everyone could see what this really was. Not a trespassing call, not a safety issue. A test. A test of who is allowed to belong, and who has to prove it. The officer tightened his grip, ready to make an arrest on the front steps of a home Marcus had owned for 35 years. And the worst part? Marcus already knew how this story usually ends. But this time, the system had picked the wrong man. Marcus Thorne had lived on this block long before it became fashionable to call it historic. 35 years earlier, when the brownstone was still cracked, dark, and forgotten by the city. He had bought it outright, not as an investment, not as a flip, but as a home, a place to grow old with dignity. Back then, no one asked who he was. No one questioned why he belonged. He had restored the building himself, the carved gargoyles along the roofline, the iron railings on the steps, the mahogany double doors that still carried faint scars from his own hands, sanding them down late into the night after long days in court. This stoop wasn't a backdrop. It was a timeline. It had watched Marcus leave every morning in a tailored suit, briefcase in hand, to preside over federal trials that decided the fate of corporations, politicians, and criminal enterprises. It had watched him return late at night, tired but upright, a man who believed deeply in the promise of the law. Now, at 62, retired from the bench, Marcus sat there not as Your Honor, but simply as himself, a black man enjoying his morning. And that, apparently, was the problem. Because the neighborhood had changed. The buildings were the same, but the expectations were not. New tenants arrived with new assumptions about safety, about ownership, about who was supposed to be visible and who was supposed to disappear. To some, Marcus didn't look like a homeowner. He looked like a question mark. And in a city where fear moves faster than facts, a question mark is all it takes. As Marcus sat quietly, sipping his tea. He wasn't unaware of what was unfolding. He had seen this pattern before, not from the defendant's chair, but from the bench. He knew how easily perception became probable cause, how quickly comfort for one person turned into danger for another. He also knew something else. When the police arrived, the truth would matter far less than the optics. A black man on the steps, a white man claiming fear. The rest of the story would write itself unless someone forced it to stop. And Marcus Thorne was done letting silence decide the outcome. Greg Miller hadn't planned on calling the police that morning. At least, that's what he would later tell himself. He had just come back from what he liked to call a run, though the spotless shoes and untouched sweatbands suggested more image than effort. He slowed as he approached the building, eyes locking onto the figure seated on the stoop. An older black man. Robe. T. Gend reblued. Newspaper. Greg stopped walking. Something about the scene didn't fit the version of the neighborhood he thought he'd moved into. This was supposed to be a place for professionals. Quiet. Predictable. Controlled. Not this. Excuse me. Greg called out, forcing his voice to sound firm instead of unsure. You can't sit here. Marcus didn't respond immediately. That silence irritated Greg more than any argument could have. This is a private residence. Greg continued, stepping closer but not crossing the iron gate. We don't want people hanging out on the stoop. It makes residents uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word came easily to him. It always did. I live here. Marcus replied calmly. You're blocking my entrance. Greg laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter felt like power. Look, man, I'm trying to be nice. Just move along. There's a park 2 blocks away. Or a shelter. He said it like a suggestion, but it was a command. Marcus folded his newspaper carefully and placed it beside his chair. You're free to do what you feel is necessary. He said, but I would advise you to think carefully before escalating this. Greg didn't hear caution. He heard defiance. And in his mind, defiance from someone who didn't belong was a threat. He pulled out his phone. Fingers already moving. Fine. You want to make this difficult? I'll let the police handle it. He turned slightly away, dialing, but never breaking eye contact as if daring Marcus to move. When the dispatcher answered, Greg's tone changed instantly. Yeah. Hi. I'm at 4200 Oakwood Avenue. There's a man sitting on the front steps of my building refusing to leave. A pause. He's not threatening me. But I don't feel safe. He's being aggressive. Across the street, a woman paused mid-motion, her garden hose spilling water onto the sidewalk. She stared at the scene. Confusion etched on her face. Marcus picked up his teacup again. Unfazed. But he understood exactly what was happening. The language Greg used wasn't accidental. Refusing to leave. Aggressive. Don't feel safe. Each phrase carefully chosen, not to describe reality, but to summon authority. When Greg ended the call, he exhaled, shoulders loosening. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. They're on the way, he said. You can still save yourself the trouble. Marcus looked at him steadily. I've seen this trouble before, he replied, and it never starts with the truth. Greg didn't understand the warning, but he was about to. The dispatcher didn't see what was happening on Oakwood Avenue. She never could. All she had were words and words. When chosen carefully, had the power to become handcuffs. Sir, is he threatening you? The dispatcher asked. Greg hesitated, eyes flicking back to Marcus, who was calmly lifting his teacup again. as if nothing of consequence were unfolding. "Well, not directly," Greg said. "But he's refusing to leave after I asked him. He's trespassing." Trespassing. The word landed heavy. "And I don't feel safe entering my own home." Greg added quickly. "He's a big guy. Just sitting there, staring." From where Marcus sat, the street looked exactly as it always had. Quiet. Ordinary. Safe. But the narrative had already shifted. "Okay. Sir," the dispatcher said, typing, "we have a unit in the area. Stay on the line or keep a safe distance." When Greg hung up, he crossed his arms, relief washing over his face. The decision was no longer his. He had passed responsibility and power to the system. Police are on the way. Marcus turned another page of the Wall Street Journal. But his mind wasn't on the markets anymore. He knew what the call log would say. Suspicious male, refusing to leave, possible trespass. That was all it took. No mention of a silk robe. No mention of tea. No mention of a man calmly sitting on his own front steps. Just a silhouette shaped by fear. Marcus had written rulings on probable cause. He had spent years reminding officers that discomfort was not a crime, and suspicion was not evidence. But he also knew how often those principles collapsed once optics took over. By the time the sirens arrived, the truth would already be on trial. Across the street, the woman with the garden hose shook her head slowly. She recognized Marcus. Everyone who'd been here long enough did. But the new faces didn't ask neighbors. They asked authority. And authority was already on its way, lights off. Assumptions on. Ready to resolve a problem that had never existed. Marcus set his cup down gently. He straightened his posture, not in fear, in preparation, because he knew the next few minutes would decide more than just his morning. They would decide whether the law still meant what it claimed to mean, or whether belonging would once again be determined by who felt afraid. Officer Kyle Vance arrived without sirens. Just the low crunch of tires over dry leaves as his cruiser pulled up to the curb. From behind the windshield, he took in the scene in seconds the way officers are trained to do. A young white man on the sidewalk, pacing, arms crossed, visibly agitated. An older black man on the steps, sitting still, far too comfortable. To Officer Vance, that comfort was the first red flag. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his utility belt, his hand resting near his holster, not drawing it, but letting everyone know it was there. "Officer, over here," Greg called, rushing toward him. "That's him. He won't leave." Vance nodded, offering Greg a look that said, "You did the right thing." He didn't ask how long Greg had lived there. He didn't ask who Marcus was. He didn't ask a single question that might complicate the narrative he already believed. Instead, he walked past Greg and stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at Marcus like a teacher addressing a misbehaving student. "All right," Vance said loudly. "Time to move along. You can't camp out here." Marcus slowly folded his newspaper. "I'm not camping," he said. "I live here." Vance gestured back toward Greg without turning around. "The resident says you're trespassing. That's enough for me." In that moment, the badge spoke louder than the truth. Marcus met his gaze. "I am the resident. In fact, I own this building." Vance laughed short, sharp, dismissive. "Sure you do," he said, "and I own City Hall." He stepped onto the first stair, closing the distance. "Let's not play games. Now." Marcus remained seated. "I have committed no crime," he said evenly. and I'm under no legal obligation to provide identification during a consensual encounter. The words landed like a challenge. Vance's jaw tightened. He didn't hear a law-abiding citizen. He heard defiance. And in his world, defiance from someone like Marcus wasn't protected speech. It was a problem to be corrected. "Stand up," Vance ordered. "This is no longer a request." Across the street, the woman with the garden hose stopped completely. A delivery truck slowed to a crawl. Phones began to rise. Something was about to happen. And Marcus knew it. He had seen this exact moment unfold in courtrooms the second when authority chose escalation over verification. The second when bias stopped being internal and became action. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He didn't reach for anything. He stayed exactly where he was because he knew movement. At this moment, could be rewritten as threat. "Officer," Marcus said calmly. Each word measured. "Deliberate. You are operating on the unverified claim of a man who moved into this building 3 weeks ago. I have lived here for 35 years. Vance didn't respond. He stepped up another stair. "You're refusing a lawful order." Vance snapped. "That gives me grounds to detain you." "That is incorrect," Marcus replied. "Refusing to comply with an unlawful order is not grounds for detention. You have no reasonable suspicion of a crime." The air shifted. To Vance, this wasn't a legal discussion. It was a challenge to authority. In his 5 years on the force, he had learned one dangerous lesson. Well, people who quoted the law were usually the ones who needed to be controlled. "Look," Vance said, his voice hardening. "The complainant says you don't belong here. That's enough. That is not how the Constitution works." Marcus said, "And I strongly advise you to call your supervisor before this escalates." The word supervisor landed like an insult. Vance's face flushed. "I don't need a supervisor to handle a vagrant." He shot back. From the sidewalk, Greg shifted nervously, trying to sound helpful. "He's been really stubborn." "Officer, acts like he owns the place." "They always do," Vance muttered. Marcus felt the weight of that sentence, not because it was loud, but because it revealed everything. This was no longer about trespassing. It was about fitting a narrative, and Marcus didn't fit it. "Officer," Marcus said, his tone dropping, colder now, "you are about to make a grave mistake. I am asking you for your own sake to slow down." Vance reached for his handcuffs. "Last chance," he said. "ID. Or you're going in cuffs." Marcus nodded once. Not in fear. In resolve. "I am not resisting," he said clearly, projecting his voice for every witness, now watching. "But you are about to arrest a man on his own property without cause." Phones were up now. Several of them. The block had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. Vance took one more step forward and crossed a line he would never be able to uncross. Vance lunged forward. Not running, not rushing, just fast enough to make it clear who was in control. His hand clamped around Marcus's upper arm. The contact was sudden, jarring in its certainty. Marcus did not pull away. He did not tense up. He let his body go slack. "I am complying," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying down the block. "I am not resisting." To anyone watching, the optics were unmistakable. An older man in a robe, seated, calm, and an officer forcing him up by the arm. "Stop fighting me," Vance shouted, not because Marcus was fighting, but because the words needed to exist, because the report would need them later. The teacup rattled on the small table beside the chair. trembling but not tipping over. Across the street, the woman with the garden hose finally found her voice. "Officer, what are you doing?" she yelled. "That's Mr. Thorne." 2 more doors opened. A man stepped onto his porch. Phone already raised. Another neighbor froze halfway down the sidewalk. "That's a judge." Someone shouted. "You've got the wrong man." Vance didn't turn around. Acknowledging them would mean admitting doubt. And doubt, at this point, was dangerous. "Hands behind your back," Vance ordered, twisting Marcus's arm with unnecessary force. Pain shot through Marcus's shoulder, an old injury flaring instantly. His jaw tightened, but he did not cry out. He would not give the officer that. "You are escalating a non-existent situation," Marcus said through clenched teeth. "You are being recorded." The cuffs came out, metal against skin. Click, click. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Marcus felt the cold steel bite into his wrists. Trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. Vance recited, like a spell that could turn fiction into fact. On the sidewalk, Greg's confidence wavered. "Wait," he stammered. He owns the building. I think." "You called it in," Vance snapped without looking at him. "I'm handling it." Phones were everywhere now. Held high. Steady. Unblinking. One voice cut through the noise calm. "Precisi. It is. 87 A.M." A man said into his camera, "Officer has just handcuffed Marcus Thorne on the front steps of his own home." Marcus straightened as much as the cuffs allowed. "This is not the end of this," he said quietly. But Vance had already made his choice. He shoved Marcus forward, guiding him down the steps and toward the patrol car past neighbors who stared in disbelief. Past a man who had thought a phone call would make him safer. The door opened. Marcus was bent down and pushed inside. The door slammed shut, and in that moment behind steel, glass, and certainty the system believed it had won. It hadn't realized yet that it had just arrested the wrong man. The back seat of the patrol car smelled like disinfectant and old mistakes. Hard plastic pressed against Marcus's back as the door slammed shut, sealing him inside a narrow cage designed to remind you exactly who was in control. Officer Vance walked around the front of the cruiser with a visible swagger. Adrenaline still humming through him. To him, this was resolution. A problem removed. "Comfortable back there?" he asked, glancing at Marcus through the rearview mirror as he put the car in drive. Marcus met his eyes calmly through the wire mesh. "Officer Vance," he said, reading the nameplate on the dashboard. "I want you to remember this moment. Remember how confident you feel right now." Vance snorted. "Yeah, save it. You can explain your story to the judge." Marcus didn't raise his voice. "I am the judge," he said quietly. Vance laughed sharp. Dismissive. Everyone says that. The cruiser pulled away from Oakwood Avenue, leaving behind stunned neighbors, raised phones, and a story that was already uploading itself to the internet. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, ignoring the pain radiating through his shoulders. In his mind, he began doing what he had done his entire career, documenting time of arrest, lack of probable cause, failure to verify ownership, witnesses ignored, excessive force. By the time they reached the precinct, the file was already forming. Inside the booking area, Sergeant Dennis Kowalski looked up from his desk as Vance marched his prisoner forward. "What do we have?" Kowalski asked, barely glancing up. "Trespassing, disorderly, resisting." Vance replied confidently, Guy was loitering on a stoop and wouldn't ID. Kowalski finally looked and froze. The robe, the posture, the face he had seen across a courtroom years ago. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Vance, Kowalski said slowly, his voice dropping. Who, exactly, is this? Vance shrugged. Some guy who thinks he owns half the block. Kowalski stepped closer, eyes widening. Your Honor, he whispered. The room went silent. Keyboards stopped clicking. A fingerprint scanner hummed uselessly. Every head turned. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Good morning. Sergeant, he said. I believe we met during the O'Malley trial. The color drained from Vance's face. What he said? No, he refused to ID. Kowalski turned on him, horror replacing disbelief. This, he said sharply, is Judge Marcus Thorne, retired federal district court judge, chairman of the Civilian Oversight Board. Vance took a half step back. In one sentence, the world flipped. The man in cuffs was no longer a suspect. He was the authority, and for the first time since arriving on Oakwood Avenue, Officer Kyle Vance understood something far more terrifying than resistance. He understood consequences. The silence in the booking room felt heavier than the handcuffs. Officer Vance stood frozen, his confidence draining by the second as the words Judge Marcus Thorne echoed through the space. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a collapse. Sergeant Kowalski didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Vance, he said quietly, give me the keys. Vance hesitated. Now, Kowalski repeated. The keys slipped from Vance's shaking hand and clattered onto the linoleum floor. He didn't bend to pick them up. Do not remove the cuffs yet, Marcus said calmly. Not until this is documented. Kowalski looked at him, startled. Sir, I want photographs taken of my wrists. Marcus continued. Before anything changes. Time-stamped. On record. A crime scene technician was summoned. Nervous. Apologetic. She raised the camera and captured the damage red. Angry marks where the steel had cut into Marcus's skin. Bruising already blooming beneath. Each click of the camera felt like a gavel striking wood. Captain Elena Rossi arrived moments later. Breathless from the speed of it all. She took in the scene in one glance, the robe. The cuffs. The officer standing small in the corner. Unlock him. She ordered immediately. After documentation. Marcus replied. Buy the book. Rossi nodded. Proceed. When the cuffs finally came off, Marcus rotated his wrists slowly. The pain was sharp, but controlled. He did not dramatize it. He didn't need to. He turned to Captain Rossi. His voice steady, authoritative. Officer Vance arrested me on the curtilage of my own home. He ignored my statements of ownership. He refused to verify property records. He dismissed multiple witnesses. He escalated without cause. Vance opened his mouth. Be quiet, Rossi snapped, cutting him off. She turned back to Marcus. Sir, I am deeply sorry. This should never have happened. Marcus nodded once. Apologies are not accountability. Rossi turned toward Vance. Her expression hard. Badge. Gun. On the desk. The room seemed to shrink. Vance slowly unpinned the badge he had polished that morning. He placed it on the desk, then unbuckled his weapon. The weight of it hit the surface with a dull, final thud. You are placed on administrative leave effective immediately, Rossi said. Internal Affairs will be notified. You are not to enter secure areas again. Kowalski stepped forward to escort him out. As Vance was led away, stripped of uniform and authority, Marcus watched silently. For the first time that day, the system was being forced to look at itself, and it didn't like what it saw. By the time Captain Rossi drove Marcus Thorne back to Oakwood Avenue, the story no longer belonged to the police department. It belonged to the public. The video had already spread not because it was dramatic, but because it was unmistakable. A calm, older black man in a silk robe. An aggressive young officer. Neighbors shouting the truth. And the truth being ignored. Within 3 hours, the clip had crossed 2 million views. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Headlines didn't ask what Marcus had done. They asked why he had been arrested at all. On Oakwood Avenue, reporters crowded the sidewalk where the patrol car had been parked just hours earlier. Microphones stood where Marcus's chair had been. Camera lenses pointed at the steps that had become evidence. Across town, Greg Miller sat alone in his apartment. Phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from friends, from coworkers, from strangers who now knew his name. That's the guy who called the cops. Racist neighbor. Weaponized 911. Greg didn't answer any of them. 2 days later, a process server knocked on his door. "You are being served," the man said, handing him a thick envelope. "Eviction for violation of the harassment and nuisance clauses of your lease." Greg stared at the papers, stunned. "But I have a lease," he whispered. "The owner has terminated it for cause." The server replied, "You have 72 hours to vacate." The irony didn't need explanation. Meanwhile, City Hall scrambled. The mayor issued a statement, carefully worded, apologetic, but cautious. The police chief promised a review. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, but none of it felt fast enough. Because the public had already reached its verdict, this wasn't about one officer. It was about a system that trusted fear over facts and had done so for far too long. And Marcus Thorne knew exactly what came next. Marcus Thorne did not give a victory speech. He gave a statement. 2 days after the arrest, he stood behind a podium placed directly on the same front steps where the handcuffs had closed around his wrists. His arms were bandaged. His posture was straight. His voice steady. "I am not here for money," Marcus said, looking out at the sea of cameras. "I have money. I am here because if this can happen to me, a man who owns his home, who knows the law, who has the resources to fight, then what happens to the man who has none of those things?" The question landed hard. Behind him stood attorneys from one of the top civil rights firms in the state. But the lawsuit bore a familiar name. Thorne v. City of Oakwood. Et al. It was not a routine filing. It cited unlawful detention, excessive force, failure to supervise. But it went further, attacking training protocols, departmental culture, and the quiet tolerance of repeated misconduct. The city attorney reviewed the evidence, the video, the witness statements, Officer Vance's prior complaints, and delivered a blunt recommendation to the city council. "Settle," he said. "If this goes to trial, Judge Thorne will cross-examine the department himself. There is no defense here." 6 months later, the settlement was finalized. $6.5 million. The largest wrongful arrest payout in the city's history. But Marcus never cashed the check. Instead, he redirected it. Every dollar. Towards something the system had never given him, that morning protection. The Thorne Legal Defense Fund was announced 1 week later. A nonprofit clinic dedicated to providing free legal representation to victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. No press gimmicks. No donor's wall. Just lawyers. Case files. and people who had never thought the law would work for them. Marcus didn't just challenge the system. He built a counterweight to it. Weeks later, the morning on Oakwood Avenue looked almost the same. The same brownstone, the same stone steps, the same quiet street. Marcus Thorne sat on the stoop again. A fresh cup of Earl Grey steamed gently on the small bistro table beside him. The Wall Street Journal rested open on his lap, the pages catching the light of the early sun. But something had changed. This time, Marcus wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a young woman in her mid-20s, a law degree barely a year old, her notebook already filled with handwritten questions. Sarah was the first attorney hired by the Thorne Legal Defense Fund. So in cases like this, she asked, flipping a page, do we focus more on the illegal stop or the pattern behind it? Marcus smiled slightly. You do both, he said. You challenge the action, and you expose the policy that allowed it. You don't just trim the branches. You go after the root. Sarah nodded, scribbling furiously. Across the street, a police cruiser rolled slowly past. The officer inside glanced over, recognized Marcus, and gave a respectful nod. Marcus returned it. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was acknowledgement. Marcus leaned back slightly, letting the sun warm his face. He thought about the cuffs, the cold plastic seat, the certainty in Officer Vance's voice when he said, "You don't live here." He had learned long ago that dignity isn't something the system gives you. It's something you insist on. Marcus couldn't stop the handcuffs from going on that morning, but he made sure that when they came off, they changed the world around him. And somewhere else in the city, another young black man sat in his car, or on a bench, or on his own front steps, wondering if he was about to be questioned, challenged, or removed from a place he had every right to be. That's why this story matters. Because this was never just about one officer, or one bad decision. It was about what happens when authority goes unchecked, and who pays the price when it does. So, here's the question we'll leave you with. Should police officers be personally, financially liable when they violate civil rights instead of taxpayers footing the bill? And have you ever had to prove you belonged somewhere you had every right to be? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in accountability, justice, and telling stories that hold power to account, hit like, subscribe, and share, because silence is how systems stay broken. And stories like this are how they change.